We have a dynamic speaker. Danny Avula was born in India, immigrated to this country when he was only a year old. He is a board-certified pediatrician, a preventive medicine physician, currently serving as the Deputy Director of the Richmond City Health Department. In addition to his role as a preventive medicine physician, he's also a board-certified pediatrician and continues to practice at pediatric hospitals all across the area there near Richmond. He's been recognized by Style Weekly as one of Richmond's top 40 under 40 and Our Health magazine of one of Richmond's top 15 healthcare leaders under 40 for his commitment to improving Richmond's health. His work has also been featured by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, MSNBC, and Christianity Today. You see, back in 2004, Danny and his wife, Mary Kay, made a commitment with a group of college friends to move into a low-income neighborhood and simply be good neighbors to people whose lives look very different than their own. So now, 10 years later, they found themselves in the midst of a revival, a rebirth of sorts, in this area of town called North Church Hill. It is a transformation that is full of hope, but it's also one that presents daily complex challenges related to race, class, and justice. Three of the topics that we talked about a great deal here at Ollie over the last 3 years during this summer series, and are continuing to do so today. A fascinating individual with an incredible life story. Would you please welcome Dr. Danny Avula?
Wouldn't life be so much more exciting if everybody had Mark Quinn following them around? Thank you for that, Mark. I am so thankful that so many of you were willing to come here tonight and to listen to a guy you've never heard of talk about things with much less expertise and academic rigor than I think you guys are probably used to at such a fine institution here. And I checked out the PowerPoint slides that Dr. Hennessy presented to you all last week. And it looked like you guys had a really intense conversation, looking really granularly at some census level data and talking about really weighty things that are important to communities of poverty, things like Medicaid and earned income tax credit and the living wage. And I think I can assure you guys today that what I'll be presenting is basically the opposite of that. There will be no data, no charts, no graphs, no tables, nothing that's really rooted in any real research, which may not be what most of you were hoping for. So I'm sorry if I just lost you, but hopefully the six of you who are still with me and who I still have some credibility with will take a moment to listen to some of my personal stories. From our life in my community, where we have grappled with issues of race and class and gentrification and education and justice over the last 10 years. And I want to start with an article that a friend sent me last year. This is from the Boston Globe. It can never be said that Adele Gabourey's neighbors were less than responsible. When her front lawn grew hip high, they had a local boy mow it down. When her pipes froze and burst, they had the water turned off. When the mail spilled out the front door, they called the police. The only thing they didn't do was check to see if she was alive. She wasn't. On Monday, police climbed her crumbling brick stoop, broke in the side door of her little blue house, and found what they believed to be the 73-year-old woman's skeletal remains, sunk in a 5-foot-high pile of trash where they had apparently lain, perhaps for as long as 4 years. Eileen Dugan, 70, once a close friend of Gabourey's, whose house sits less than 20 feet from the dead woman's home, said this: "It's not a really friendly neighborhood." Now that might be the understatement of the year. And I left that article thinking, how could this happen? And then 4 months ago, I see this come across the CNN news ticker, this one in Michigan. For years, the payments went out of the woman's bank account. Nobody batted an eyelid. Bills were paid and life went on as normal in the quiet neighborhood of Pontiac, Michigan. Neighbors didn't notice anything unusual. The woman traveled a lot, they said, and kept to herself. One of them mowed her grass to keep things looking tidy. At some point, her bank account ran dry. The bills stopped being paid. After its warnings went unanswered, the bank holding the mortgage foreclosed on the house, a common occurrence in a region hit hard by economic woes. Still, nobody noticed what had happened inside the house. Nobody wondered out loud what became of the owner. Not until this week, when a worker sent by the bank to repair a hole in the roof made a grisly discovery. The woman's mummified body was sitting in the back seat of her car parked in the garage. The key was halfway in the ignition. Authorities say they believe the woman died at least 5 years ago. They're still trying to figure out what happened. So I left that article saying, what kind of world do we live in where people are so disconnected from their communities that this can happen not once but twice in the span of 12 months or so? But when I think about it, the neighborhood that we moved into when I first moved to Richmond 14 years ago wasn't probably much different from these neighborhoods. There wasn't this close, tight-knit sense of community. For all I know, this did happen in our community, and maybe I'll read about it in 2 or 3 years in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. But the reality is that I only knew a handful of people in my community. We had a few conversations, mostly surface level, but the vast majority of the folks in my community were nameless faces to me. And this didn't really seem weird to me, right? It didn't seem weird because it's what I had grown up in. I grew up in the suburbs of Northern Virginia. It was a fairly transient community. I imagine there were a lot of people who traveled a lot and kept to themselves. And so in the same way that our neighborhood in Richmond was, the neighborhood I grew up in was a bunch of nameless faces. And what's crazy is that it took a drastic move into an impoverished inner city community for me to question that vision and for me to say, you know what, should community look different than this? The vision of community that I had that I'd grown up with, and the vision that I think our culture in some ways compels us towards, may be off the mark. So what is it, you ask, that changed my life so profoundly that my wife and I would uproot and move to a community like this, where gunshots were a weekly occurrence, if not daily in some cases, where there were as many boarded up houses as there were people living in them, where there wasn't a grocery store for miles, but you can best be sure that there were corner stores every few blocks to make sure I could get all the pork rinds and 40 ounces I could ever ask for. Why would anyone who had a choice choose to move to a community like this and say, yeah, this is where I want to move and plant roots and raise my family? What compelled us to move there? Well, it was these guys. Some of you are probably thinking it's a little bit insane to let this group of college kids dictate any major life decisions, and you're probably right. But these were my roommates in college. We were at school at UVA, and these are my best friends in the world. And college is a really special time of life, right? Like, there are probably two things that come to my mind as things that really facilitate relationship: time and proximity. And college offers those things in spades, right? Arguably, college is the time of your life where you have more free time than you ever will or ever will again. And proximity, you're plunked into this community where you're surrounded by thousands of people your age and you're going through this intense shared experience together. And so when those two things come together, time and proximity, it's a breeding ground for some pretty beautiful and rich relationships. And that certainly is what happened here. I lived with these guys for 3 years, and I don't know that we recognized it at the time, but we definitely recognized it when this ended. The year after college, we were all over the world. I had one friend who went to do medical missions in Nigeria. Another took a job out in California. Another went to work for a theologian in London. And so literally, we were scattered all over the world. And this conversation started. All of us in our own ways, we were yearning for that richness of friendship. We missed what we had and people who knew us well, and they were just a heck of a lot of fun to be with. And this conversation started. Would it be so crazy if we started to prioritize our relationships over the things that our culture typically tells us to prioritize? Getting the best jobs or going to the best schools. Would it be that crazy? The years that followed, we all ended up getting married, most of us to women who had gone to UVA with us and who had somehow found it in their hearts to hang out with this group of loonies. But we'd see each other every year at weddings, and the conversation started to mature as you might expect when the more sensible gender gets involved. And I will say that there was another theme during our college years that really influenced this conversation. A couple of these guys started a alternative spring break trip to visit a community down in Jackson, Mississippi, and to visit a community that had been started by a man named John Perkins. Dr. Perkins was a civil rights leader and a man who had committed his life to racial reconciliation and had facilitated this community in Jackson where people of different races and classes would intentionally come to live among one another and engage around these very weighty issues. And so, for this group of college kids going down there every spring, they would see people, black, white, rich, poor, living together, talking about history and about race and how it affects their experience. And this was incredibly formational for this group of friends and a larger group at UVA. And so that conversation about, would it be crazy for us to prioritize each other's relationships started to evolve into what would it look like if we were to commit to each other relationally, but move into a neighborhood and invest in a community and do it not for the sake of us or our fun or just how cool it would be to live with your best friends, but to do it for the good of the community. And that is what happened. 10 years ago, there were 4 couples who decided to move into the East End neighborhood of Church Hill, Richmond, Virginia. And we moved into a 2-block radius into a community that was predominantly low-income African American. And we're all still here, and or there, as the case may be. And it has been an amazing journey, and I'll tell you about some of that today. So the early years, I think back to that first period of our life there, and there were just we were an anomaly in every way, right? I mean, there really weren't any other, certainly Indians, but not even middle-class educated, and not even that many white folks, period. And I can't tell you the number of times that people would come up to me and look at me and say, "You a cop?" Right? Like that was the only plausible reason that I might live in a community like that. I was also really amazed by the way that kids gravitated towards any adult who would take the time to talk to them and to spend some time with them and to, hear their story, engage in some activity with them. And so kids would flock to our house. My wife is an elementary school teacher, and when we moved into the neighborhood, she actually left the West End and started teaching at the school in our neighborhood. And it kind of gave us an immediate connection to a lot of different families. And so kids would flock to our house. It was this kind of revolving door. And I remember one distinct story where I was a resident at the time, and I just worked an overnight call, and I came home and passed out on the couch. And I woke to a start, and this little boy was kneeling down, looking at me, nose to nose, 4 inches across, and he was like petting me. He was stroking my hair. And I was like, "Daquan, what are you doing?" And he said, "I like your hair. You got hair like Jackie Chan." I included this slide in case anybody doesn't know who Jackie Chan is. But it occurred to me at that point that, this kid has probably never seen an Indian. I'm probably the first Indian that he's come into relationship with. There was another instance where a friend of mine, one of the guys from college, was moving in across the street. And on move-in day, he went over to meet his neighbor, and he reaches out his hand and he said, "Hi, nice to meet you. My name's Ramesh." And the guy grabs takes his hand and he says, "It's T-Yo." And Ramesh goes, "T-Yo, nice to meet you." And he goes, "Nah, T-Yo." And Ramesh goes, "T-Yo," thinking he got the emphasis wrong, right? And he goes, "No, T as in Thomas, yo as in the figure of speech." And it's the first time I'd heard the figure of speech, yo. But I will say that, that anecdote kind of was an example of how all of us in this time were learning a new language, right? Literally learning a new dialect, but also, on a broader sense, learning a new culture and a new custom and a new way of being. The customs that we had come to this community with really didn't fit. I remember in that first year, we had a neighbor over to dinner, a gentleman who came in, and it was, two of the most awkward hours of my life. Like, we didn't have anything to talk about, and I'm fairly good at conversing with people, and it was so hard. And he didn't tell me until years later that he was really nervous about that, right? Like, he didn't know what the etiquette was. He didn't know how to act. He didn't know what to do with all the forks that were on the table. And so that environment was really foreign to him. And so I had to learn the customs of the neighborhood. I had to learn, how does relationship happen here? And in my neighborhood, a lot of relationship happens out on the street. It happens when you're sitting on your front porch, just hanging out. A lot of folks in my neighborhood don't have cars, so they're walking to and from the corner stores or to the bus stop. And so there's a medium for relationship. People are running into each other all the time. And it was so so memorable to me that in that first month of living in this community, I remember that I'd had more conversations with neighbors than I had in the previous 3 years from the suburban neighborhood I'd come from. And it just, there's something about that, like life on life collisions that are happening in a community that really fosters relationship. And so this theme of learning new ways to be that has marked much of the last decade for me, and for all of these group of friends who have moved into the community. We've learned a lot, and we continue to learn more every day. And we've really been changed by many of the things we've seen. We've really been challenged by some of the things we've seen. And we've really been blessed by a lot of the things that we've seen. We have felt incredibly loved by a community that loves our children. My 2-year-old daughter, her best friend is a 300-pound black man named Reggie, who lives next door. And Reggie just loves the heck out of my kids, all 4 of them. We've got 7, 6, 4, and 2, and Reggie adores them, but especially Abby. And I guess her 2 Valentine's days ago, he gave her this little white bear. It's her favorite stuffed animal, and she calls it Reggie Bear. And Reggie is pushing 70, and he's not in the best of health, but he has told me on several occasions that my kids are the reason that he gets out of bed every day. And it's just, like to think about how connected we are because we live next door to each other, and we literally see each other every day. And there is that piece of proximity of just being in each other's lives that really fosters relationship. We've also often felt overwhelmed by the tangible needs in our community. We regularly have neighbors stay in our home, sometimes for a few days, sometimes for a few weeks, sometimes for many, many months. Back in January, we just had a 22-year-old mom and her 8-year-old son move out after living with us for a year and a half. But the opportunity to live with folks who are so different than my wife and I, and to kind of be engaged in life together, has taught me so much. And in many ways, the experience that we just went through in doing that budget, it's that kind of insider look at what folks in my neighborhood are up against. And it's overwhelming to think, like, can they really get out of this cycle of poverty? I mean, it's really overwhelming sometimes to think about that. We felt frustrated at times when, our neighbors seemed to make terrible decisions about how they're going to spend their money. I've had neighbors who get their tax check and blow it on entertainment, but Mark's points were poignant. They don't get another opportunity during the year to do that, and who am I to judge them for that? And so, at the same time in sharing those frustrations, we've also been frustrated at the system that has created those kinds of circumstances where what seem like obviously good, right decisions to me aren't so obvious for my neighbors. And our recent foray into the school system has left us really confused. We've got 3 kids in public school. We'll have 3 kids in public schools this fall. And, there's a balance that we have had to figure out about our calling as parents and our responsibility to our kids and our calling to our community. And I think that's something that will continue to be a part of our story. I could go on and on with anecdotes that kind of illustrate the spectrum from like the sheer joy that we experience to the utter despair that we see in our community. But suffice it to say that the collective of all of these experiences have led to this deep sense of kind of heart level satisfaction and affirmation of our place here in this community. And so I hope that some of these thoughts and some of these stories will challenge you guys to think a little bit about community and to think at least, at the very least, about wanting a community where someone might notice if you happen to die in your garage. But in the best case scenario, to think about a community where people are living with intentionality and really like seeking to engage authentic relationships with their neighbors. Mark mentioned to you guys that I am a public health physician, and I would say that the experience of living in a community like this has totally changed how I do my job, right? At a 10,000 foot level, it gives me a lot of perspective about what our residents are going through and the challenges that many of the members of my community face. And even practical things. We talk about healthy living and healthy eating, and as we went through this budget exercise, it's just not possible for so many of my neighbors. So it gives me a lot of big picture perspective for the work that I do in policymaking and developing programs for our city. But it's also made the work really personal. Right? The guys that I see dealing drugs on the streets are kids that I was throwing the football with 8, 10 years ago. That teen mom who is pushing her stroller down the street was like literally just a couple years ago a 7-year-old kid who was jumping rope, right? And that personal connection has been really hard but really fulfilling for my vocational work. And that teen mom becomes a huge part of what we do in public health, Imagine that you are a teen mom. In teen pregnancies in Richmond throughout the 90s and 2000s, Richmond had the highest teen pregnancy rates in the state, some of the highest rates in the country. And as a med student, I would often think about, what do we need to do so that these moms will stop, these 15, 16-year-old girls will stop bringing babies into this clinic. And I think about, maybe we need more education, or maybe we need to make contraception more available, or maybe we just need to do after-school programming so kids aren't having sex all the time. And and so some of those things are still viable public health strategies. Some of those things are things we're employing right now. But it wasn't until I moved to Church Hill and started listening to the stories of my neighbors that I realized that this problem of teen pregnancy isn't always an accident. There's a lot of reasons that I don't still quite have my head around that a lot of young girls want to get pregnant. And it's not always the case, and I wouldn't even say it's the majority of the case, but the phenomenon exists a lot more than we might like to think. So think about this, in a world that these young ladies are living in, having a baby as a teenager is totally normal. Right? It wasn't when I was in clinical practice, it wasn't uncommon for us to have a teen mom come in with her newborn and her mother. And so these newly minted grandmothers were like 35 or 36 years old. And so this was a generational phenomenon, right? This was the norm of the community. In other cases, teenagers might have had a practical reason for wanting to get out, right? A young woman named Keisha was living in a 1,000-square-foot house with 17 different people. She got pregnant at 15, had a baby at 16. She got emancipated minor and got a space in public housing. And it was the first time in her life that she could call a place her own. On a deeper level, there are young girls who yearn to connect with a male partner, and they mistakenly think that having that man's child will keep him around, which is almost always not the case. And then on an even deeper level, a lot of young girls are struggling with identity. They're struggling, who are they? Who loves me? And having a child answers some of those questions, at least on paper. You've got a kid who's going to love you unconditionally and always be there. And before you actually start to think about the practicality of having a child, that sounds pretty good, right? And then on top of all this, as we just talked about, we've created a system that financially incentivizes larger families in the form of increased allotments for TANF and food stamps. But as we just saw, it actually doesn't help. So it's really a huge mistake to think that is a legitimate reason to have more children. But I have had several young girls in the neighborhood tell me that their moms have actually encouraged them to have more children so that they could draw a larger check to come into the house. So let's think a little bit more about how being Black and poor translates into the pressing public health and social well-being issues that we see in communities all across the South. Some of them we just talked through, and this may be a little bit repetitive, but bear with me. It starts here in the womb. The second a young woman gets pregnant, national data shows that Black women are 1/3 as likely as their white counterparts to get adequate prenatal care. So this late or non-existent prenatal care is just the beginning of a domino effect that leads to a whole host of complications, higher rates of infant mortality, higher rates of preterm birth, higher rates of low birth weight babies. And low birth weight then correlates to a whole nother set of negative health outcomes, increased rates of behavior problems in school, ADD and ADHD that stem back to developmental issues in the womb, a higher incidence of asthma and obesity and diabetes. And so from day one, these kids are at a disadvantage. But not all kids in poverty are born low birth weight. So what happens when these kids come home? Well, more likely than not, they're coming home to a single parent household. In the city of Richmond, African American babies, 84% of African American babies are born to single moms, as compared to 25% in their white counterparts. That is a significant issue. As you might have guessed, the overwhelming majority of those kids are coming home to single moms, and that single mom was probably herself the product of a single mom and an absent father, and so it's really rare to see kids who live with two parents or even have healthy relationships with both of their parents. But that example has a really profound impact on communities because it's self-perpetuating. That mom who is a single mother then grows up thinking that's what girls are supposed to do. They grow up to raise children, sometimes by multiple fathers, and the little boys grow up thinking that it's okay to maybe have children with multiple women and then to leave them hanging with it, right? That becomes the norm of a community. And why does the one-parent, two-parent distinction matter? Any of you guys know that have kids know that even in the best of situations, raising kids is really hard work. It's insanely stressful, right? As Kyle mentioned, it should be an Olympic sport to get kids ready at the same time. Like I said, we have 4 kids. They are 7, 6, 4, and 2, and there are days that I still wake up wondering how and why this happened. I get, the how I get, the why is, I guess, the point in question. But imagine yourself again as this young woman, and the stress of raising a child is compounded by the situation where she's trying to do it herself. And she's trying to do it with limited economic means, in circumstances where her housing is precarious and maybe and often does change frequently. And let's say she's lucky enough to have a job. With her limited education and skill set, she's probably making minimum wage, right? And so she doesn't have the money, as we just saw, to provide a quality childcare option for her child. And so then she has to rely on family. And it's more likely than not that her family doesn't have the skill set, the resources, the education to kind of provide that young developing child what it needs. And perhaps the truth is that even you as the mom don't. And it's not that people don't want the best for their kids. It's that because of the circumstances they've come from, they don't have the skill set and the education to be able to provide it. So now, imagine that you're a young man in a community like this. You've grown out without a father in the home. Your mom has been working really hard to piece things together, and so because she hasn't been around much, you haven't had a model of the importance of education. She may not have graduated from high school herself. You haven't had a model of the male work ethic. You haven't had a model of how a male engages in healthy relationships with women, and much less children. And it's a 50-50 proposition that you yourself have finished high school. And if you're in the half that didn't, your job prospects are bleak. A lot of the middle-class, blue-collar jobs that your grandfather might have used to pull himself up out of poverty left. Our country stopped making things like 30 years ago. All those jobs have been outsourced. And so you spend your days doing what your peers do, hanging out on the corner. After enough time on the corner, it becomes inevitable that you will be offered an opportunity to engage in the economic engine of that community, which is the drug trade. And even if you make a good decision and say, you know what, I don't want to do that, you're still hanging out there And it's more likely than not that the police are going to bust you for something and that you're going to get thrown in jail. And this has become a rite of passage for so many men in my community and communities all across our country. And that launches you on a trajectory that makes it even less likely that you're going to be able to find gainful employment. Once you have something on your record, it becomes incredibly difficult to be employable. Now, run this through 3 or 4 cycles, and you see that with each generation, these problems become more challenging, more entrenched, and more normal. This is the generational and cyclic poverty that exists in my neighborhood and neighborhoods across the country. And I actually, having seen this, I just feel like it is nothing short of a miracle when kids make it out of this. I mentioned the young woman and her son, Tejan, who's in the foreground here. That's my wife and 2 of my 4 kids in the background. Seeing her life, and she was the first person in her family to graduate from high school. Her dad has a life sentence for murder. Her mom and grandmother are both substance abusers. And so the amount of chaos and abuse that she has sustained over the years have just given us insight that each one of these situations is incredibly complicated and there are no easy answers. And if I had to summarize what I learned from this kind of melding of my vocational life and my personal life, it's that these issues really require complex, systemic solutions paired with profound interpersonal solutions. It's not an either-or proposition that we have to, it's a both and. Right? We have to work to change the systems. We have to care for these people as individuals. We have to address system levels like education, but we have to reach into people's hearts to break the cycle of teenage pregnancy. We have to find ways at the system level to create jobs and make it economically viable, not to be completely dependent on government assistance. But we also have to change our model of delivery for those entitlements to really, again, reach people on the heart level, to give them vision and hope and a possibility for moving forward. We have to find policy initiatives that are going to encourage mothers and fathers to work together to raise their children, but we also have to engage people at the individual level, teach them skills to engage conflict and to work cooperatively if any of this is ever going to work. So I've tried really to pattern my life after this kind of both and concept, right? But both doing 10,000-foot system level work, but it's really our life in the community that grounds me in relationship and that makes my system level work continue to be fulfilling. And that concept, of being and living in a community brings me to the topic of gentrification. Gentrification is generally defined as when an urban neighborhood starts to shift towards wealthy residents moving in, and they follows an influx of new business and new development. Some of you may have heard the Spike Lee incident a few months ago, where Spike Lee just had a tirade about all the white folks moving into his Brooklyn neighborhood and ruining things. And the standard line on gentrification is that it tends to displace long-term residents in neighborhoods like mine. And as real estate values rise and property taxes increase, it makes it more and more difficult for low-income residents to stay where they are. And this is a real thing. My friend Corey had his neighbor across the street say, "Corey, we love you. You're a great neighbor. We're so glad you're here. I need you to know that my rent has increased $100 a month since you guys have moved in." The fact is that the market has no conscience, and that the economic drivers that go into communities changing like this are so much more powerful than anything else working against it. And so now I'm in a community that is gentrifying. It happened slowly. It wasn't a lot of movement in the first 5 years, but it clearly is now. You see renovations like this where houses are being stripped down and rebuilt. You see new hip restaurants and bakeries. Churchill has now been dubbed the bakery district of Richmond, Virginia. You seem to see community gardens on every corner. And then what has been particularly interesting is this kind of juxtaposition of the hipster community. So you've got the hipster beards and the homeless beards sharing streets together. And then the truest sign that you live in a gentrified community, which is when the hipster beards and homeless beards meet playing bike polo. And this is a real thing. This is the tennis court on M Street in my neighborhood. And there's this rabid bike polo community that has emerged in the last couple of years. So when we moved into the neighborhood 10 years ago, we were really anti-gentrification. We were like, it's the worst thing that ever happened. We don't want the white folks moving in, which was so ironic because we were the gentrifiers, right? But I've learned over the 10 years that some of this needs to happen, that some form of gentrification needs to happen, because concentrated poverty is the absolute worst thing that is currently affecting our minority impoverished community, and it needs to change. There are huge downsides to it, the way that it raises rents, the way that it displaces people, and it's really forced us to ask some heavy questions of ourselves and what is our role here, and because we're clearly partly responsible for this. It has been interesting to see that there's been some recent work out of Columbia University, Dr. Lance Freeman, who has seen the opposite side of gentrification, looking at Harlem particularly. And he's seen that gentrifying neighborhoods have actually led to long-term residents staying longer, moving less, reaping the economic benefits by getting higher paying jobs, and having increased job prospects as new businesses come into the community. But this occurs especially if, and I think this is the key finding here, especially if the neighborhood is generating and improving community assets that benefit everyone, especially parks, safer streets, better schools, and most critically, job opportunities for middle and low income residents. And this is a really pressing and relevant issue for cities all across our country. There's a re-urbanization that's happened since the turn of the century where people are moving into cities. And so unless folks are thinking proactively about how to avoid bike polo, but thinking proactively about how to avoid the potential consequences of gentrification, we're just going to see this trend happen over and over and over again. So I want to talk a little bit about a word that I'm going to close on this thought, a word that has become really important to our community, and that word is shalom. And shalom is often kind of translated as peace or peace be with you, but the Hebrew translation is really much more than this. It kind of speaks to the sense of wholeness and rightness and prosperity, and probably most closely translates to an idea in the context of a community, to the idea of physical and spiritual flourishing. And this concept of flourishing has pushed many of us to think, how are we living for the common good? This concept of gentrification is probably not for everybody. I hope that some of you will think about this, but I imagine the idea of moving into a community like this is not as attainable. But I hope that we all do see that we have some responsibility to contribute to the flourishing of our community, to try to work for the common good. So what can we do? What practical things we can do? At the very least, I think we all need to acknowledge that there are issues of race and class that continue to present tangible barriers to moving forward. I think we need to read and educate ourselves about the history of our country and the history of whatever city or town that you guys live in, the history specifically of race relations in those contexts. I think we need to engage in conversation about these issues. If you're inclined to pray, there are ecumenical movements of prayer all across our country that are looking at issues of race and justice, and I believe that they're making a difference. I think we need to give our time and money to organizations that are invested in community development and in racial reconciliation. I think we need to use our influence in the political sphere to think about, whether it's formal ways like lobbying or policymaking or grassroots advocacy. I hope, it seems like part of the DNA of the Riley Institute is that these issues don't just rest on one side of the aisle or the other, but that we all have a responsibility to improving the state of affairs in our communities. And perhaps most importantly, I think that I hope that we will be challenged to pursue relationships of mutuality. We haven't talked much about mutuality, but this idea that it's not a one-way relationship. When we first moved into the community, we thought we'd fix everything with our education and our resources, and I couldn't have been more wrong. We've learned so much from our neighbors, and I think I've realized in the last decade that I have way more to learn from my brothers and sisters in poverty than I have to offer. And it's been, our experience in pursuing this shalom, this flourishing of our community, this working for the common good, that in that I have found my own personal flourishing, that I found, my personal wholeness. And so I hope that those of you who are challenged to move into these types of relationships will find that to be true as well. Thank you.
Doctor, thank you very much for that incredible story. Very inspiring. I can't imagine what the neighborhood must have thought of you and your wife and your buddies 10 years ago. Who are those people down the street and what in the heck are they doing?
Yeah.
Was it difficult to walk into that neighborhood and present yourself as somebody who wasn't just a do-gooder?
Absolutely.
Hey, I'm a doctor, I'm a pediatrician, I got these fancy degrees. How do you introduce yourself to people and act like a normal person that is there to do normal good and normal things?
Right. Well, I should be clear that I did think I was a do-gooder at the time, right? And I mean, I don't know that I had the maturity to think that the situation was otherwise, and I've learned that over the years. But to answer your specific question, I think the fact that my wife was a teacher in our neighborhood gave us a lot of credibility. It gave us a reason to be in that community and to live in that community. And there was another sort of weird thing. We had a Siberian Husky at the time, and this dog is a beautiful dog. And every day I'd walk him, and we were such an anomaly in this community. They'd never seen a Siberian Husky, and so people just flocked to us. People would want to talk about our dog and talk about life, and so again, it kind of created a medium for relationship.
But the initial action with you and your buddies and your spouses, was it this thought, this idea that if we move there, that somehow things will change? Will they change for the better? Was your idea of better actually better for that neighborhood? I mean, it brings up all kinds of questions about, well, geez, we've been living our whole life. What do you think you're going to do to change things?
Right.
And why would you even care?
Yeah, it's a really challenging issue, and I think that in many ways that's clearly not the case, right? Like, I've learned so much about loyalty and about family and about relationship that wasn't the case in my West End community. But I think the other point I made about concentrated poverty is true, that when generations of concentrated poverty exist, there needs to be an external intervention. And I'm not saying that we were the right intervention for that. I think the story is still playing out, and there are many other factors that have to come into play. But I think it's somewhere in the middle, right? Like, I think there are legitimate things that we and our sphere of influence had to offer, but I think we clearly overestimated our knowledge of what the right thing for that community was.
But I wonder sometimes in those intergenerational cycles of poverty that you see, and I walk into a lot of persistent poverty counties in the state and deal with a lot of low-income people in the work that I do. Case in point, tremendous ice storm back in February in the state, knocked out power to some folks 8, 9, 10 days. And I'm going door to door talking to people in low-income neighborhood. Cycles of poverty existed for generations back to Reconstruction. They said, well, ma'am, hopefully we're going to try to get you on by the end of the day, if not first thing tomorrow. And she goes, honey, it'll happen when it happens. They forgot about this place a long time ago. With both of her grandkids sitting right there, shaking their heads like, of course, nobody thinks of us.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that one element that's really missing in those places more than anything is just the element of hope.
It's a profound statement. And I think the element of hope is... I think about it all the time, actually.
Like, people, there's just this sense that even if you're a young man in that community, knowing there's prison, there's slinging drugs, maybe if I stay and get an education, just maybe I can get a vocational education, but that's so slim that you give up at an early age.
Yeah, it's complicated because I thought early on that just the presence of married couples and families and people who are working would start to cast a vision so that people could start to see something different and have hope.
Like, here's another example to live by, perhaps.
Yeah, right. And there was a young boy that I mentored for years named Trayvon. He's 22 now. I've known him since he was 12. And he just had a baby. And I remember multiple times along the way saying, you should really think about staying with Jessica. Think about how important that is to the child. And he looked at me and he said, that's for you. That's not for me. And so there is this element when communities gentrify, where you have predominantly low-income African-American or other minority being gentrified by predominantly white middle-class folks moving to the community, that creates all sorts of new and complex tensions. And this is something I don't talk about publicly a lot, but I do a lot with my middle class educated African American friends to say there is a void here. And that, I think if this community is really to take a step forward, we need the Black middle class to come back. And it's really hard. My Black friends will tell me I spent generations, my generation and the generation before that was all about getting out of this. And so, like, I have to understand that. But I also, the lived experience is one that needs vision, that needs hope, and that can come from folks who have made it out and who have become educated and joined the workforce.
One of the pictures that gets the biggest response, and you put up on the screen the picture of that little baby.
Yeah.
Of course, it's something we can all attach ourselves to.
Sure.
And so you're a hero. You've got 4 kids under the age of 7. That's one thing already. And you do pediatric work, but what I know of little kids being raised in a stressful environment, and you brought that word up, stress, more than once. The stressors that are involved in being raised in that environment can literally change the neural pathways in your brain, that you will somehow, some way, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but grow up fundamentally different than that child with 2 parents who's loved, cared for, looked after, spoken to, talked to. Do you see that? I mean, you must see that every single day in your neighborhood and want to save all of them, I would think.
Absolutely. And especially in the context of schools, we have so many kids who are in these communities of concentrated poverty who have come from situations just like that, and they come with ADD and ADHD and emotionally disturbed, and so the incidence of those issues are so much higher in communities like mine, and you wonder why the schools aren't working. Like, how can any teacher, any super teacher, be able to manage a classroom that has that level of learning disabilities, emotional disabilities, et cetera, et cetera? It's really difficult.
So, long answer here, I know. I'm expecting one, and I'm not expecting an answer that really gets to the heart of it, but just wave the magic wand and say Dr. Danny is in charge for a day of the city of Richmond.
Yeah.
What's the right thing to do in terms of getting the mix back on track again, where you don't have these areas of persistent poverty? What would be the magic wand that you wave to say, your life can be better if we just change this about society?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it really that Herculean task that just takes not but mind, body, spirit, church, person, the apparatus of the state, all of it?
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly no quick fix. I think some of the practical things that on a systems level can be done are really thoughtful mixed income residential developments. And, this is happening in communities all over the country, San Francisco, Boston, outside of Baltimore, Montgomery County, Maryland.
You have developments, but you don't necessarily know who's low income and who's not. Who gets a voucher and who doesn't.
Right, exactly. And you're creating housing infrastructure that supports people at all ends of the spectrum. But the key is creating that infrastructure that allows a family in poverty to live next door to a physician, and then the relationship that happens as a result of that. And as I said before, I think there needs to be a focus on a multiracial component of that too, because otherwise you get some of that rich white and poor black tension that complicates things.
But as you know, growing up in the South of the Mason-Dixon line, typically one of our most difficult challenges. We can talk about poverty all day long, and people shake their head and nod and knowingly can go. But you start talking about race, and then people want to start to leave the room and to the back of the room.
That's true. It's absolutely true. And I do think that's going to be one of the major barriers for certainly South Carolina, Virginia, probably many states in our country, that until we get real about the country's history and the impact that race and that the Jim Crow and all of that history still exists today. Until we really get honest about how that's impacting our communities, we're not going to move forward. Do you
find that people in communities of color, like the one you live in, are willing to have those conversations with you? I know they have them amongst themselves. Yeah. We have them amongst ourselves, but it's tough to get people talking to each other.
Sure. It takes time and it takes trust. And I think, that's part of one of the beautiful things that has come out of living in a community like this for 10 years is that we built that trust over time. And so, I've had a lot of really open and raw conversations about the experiences of my neighbors. And it is interesting as an Indian who has, maybe I've grown up in a majority white culture, but it is a different perspective. And maybe there's an element of trust that my wife as a white woman doesn't have, or other colleagues might. But I think that even the group of the members of our group of friends who are white, and most of them are, who have put in the time to care for people well and to love people and to be good neighbors have been able to get there as well. And it has become kind of the heartbeat of our community. Like we are here for this greater conversation. We are here to talk about these issues of race and class, and it's been powerful.
Do you ever, very personal question though, but do you ever feel ashamed to some degree now as you think back to your younger years? I've done it, I do it every day almost. When you drive by that neighborhood of low income housing, when you drive by that place you really don't want to look at because it's tough to see the folks sitting outside and there's no work and their life's not as good as yours. You ever think back to those days where that never even crossed your mind and your life before and after the neighborhood?
Yeah. I have to say that I was pretty sheltered from it. I grew up in a pretty upper class community or upper middle class community, and so there just weren't that many opportunities to be engaged in real relationship or even to drive by and see it actually. So not something that resonates with me personally, but yeah.
And what about your kids? One of the things that I'm fascinated with young children is just this inherent sense of fairness they have. They are born with it. They can see it instantly, even if they can't articulate it. Your kids are seeing a much different world than my kids might see. But growing up amongst and around this, it's all they know. How much do you talk about the neighborhood you live in as opposed to neighborhoods? Perhaps they have friends that live in other places.
Yeah.
They take trips. They know there's another world out there. What kind of conversations are you able to have at this point?
Yeah, they're young, but our 7-year-old, I think that has been part of my wife and I's process in raising our kids in this community, knowing that we have to talk about these issues, that we need to be able to give them tools to digest what they're seeing and to one of the things, I talked about the void of the Black middle class in our community. We've actually made a really intentional effort to have educated Black friends so that they don't become more kind of race focused themselves, and all they see around is in our neighborhood are low educated, low income African American folks, and I don't want that to be what they attribute to that race. And so we've in many different ways we have had to help them understand what they're seeing and help them think about different family structures and help them kind of put the pieces together about what's going on in our neighborhood versus across town.
One of the things that we try to do with this series is try to put a face on things, to put a face on all these huge numbers and pieces of data sets that we get. Yeah. Last week I told you 250,000 young people under the age of 10 living beneath the poverty line. 250,000 of our kids, 57,000 of them not receiving any sort of education whatsoever until they get into public kindergarten. None. That's a name, that's a face, but we have to think at the end of the day, seems to me what you alluded to towards the end was this has to be a spiritual journey of sorts, that you have to go inward to recognize we're talking about people, we're talking about real lives, we're talking about potential, and then the lives that are lost if they kept in this cycle of poverty.
Yeah.
You think it has to be connected to this deeper sense of purpose to some degree?
I mean, I think it is for us, but those are some pretty practical numbers, right? Like, even if you're not a spiritual person, that's got to move you. Right?
Yeah. Would you really want to lose the potential of 250,000 people and what that could do for society at large, right? If you believe in the rising tide lifts all boats.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that comes back to my comments about, using our influence in the political sphere to unearth these issues, to look at that data and to make it real, to say, this is what's happening in our community. And at some point, it's going to take a major investment of state or other resources to address some of those issues.
Well, one final thing, you've done this for a decade now. There's been lots of people who are interested. Lots of people want to hear you talk. But at the end of the day, let me say 10 years later, do you think that we can make major change in this country? Is America at large, based upon your personal experience, ready to talk about this issue of poverty and tackle it in a meaningful way?
Yeah. What I've seen in Richmond, and Richmond is the capital of the Confederacy. There's no conversation on the public scale that race and class and poverty does not come into. And if this conversation can start to happen in Richmond, I've got to have hope that it can happen anywhere.
Fantastic. Dr. Danny Avula, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Mike.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.